Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, good night, and good welcome back to the Careers Mare podcast. With me, Jacob, and my colleague Jordan, we talk to a bunch of different people across the episodes about their careers and their dream jobs, and we have a right old laugh along the way. Don't we, Jordan?
Yeah, we do, Jacob. Although I'm not having a good time right now.
Oh,
Excuse my French. I'm effing peed
why is that?
because I went and got my bike fixed because it had a puncture and I've been putting it off for months and I needed to get it serviced. So I took it to the shop and they repaired it, put new brake pads on it, serviced it, even cleaned it, fixed the puncture, picked it up the other day, happy as Larry, cycled into work, cycled back from work and got a puncture in the same tyre.
In the inner tube or the tyre?
In the tyre, little shard of glass right in the tyre.
But but the inner tube was punctured, is what I mean.
Well, I guess so, because there's no air in the tyre.
But the inner tube is the thing with the air in it, and then the inner tube is in the tyre.
What do I look like? A bike? How am I supposed to know? But how have you been? Where are my manners? How are you?
Yeah, I'm pretty good actually, because I've bought a toasting fork
Okay.
half an hour ago.
What is that?
What do you mean? What's that? Do you know what a toasting fork is?
Is it a fork that you put in the toaster to get your toast out?
No,
No.
it's a. I guess in the olden days, you would have put a piece of bread or something else you wanted to toast on the fork, and then held it out in front of the fire.
Oh, okay. So have you got a gas hob?
No. Oh, I do
Uh,
actually.
Okay. I was going to say, otherwise, what's the point?
I said
what-
the word "no" there is meant to signify no. That's not what I'm planning to use it for.
Right,
But yes, I
okay.
do have a gas hob. But it's it's apparently it's an antique, and it's got
Okay.
on the top of it, as in where you hold it, it's got a little model of Ely Cathedral,
Oh, that's
and
very
I live in
sweet.
Ely. And it was £5 on Facebook Marketplace, £3 postage and packaging. Thank you, Linda.
And if you're listening, Linda, you've made him a very happy boy. So
Yeah, so when it arrives, maybe I'll post it on our social media. Maybe I'll hijack the Instagram account from you, Jordan, and do maybe a post or two or 5 or 20 posts about it.
can you do one in every room of your house?
Yeah,
And then maybe
it's
one
all
of your
20 rooms in my
Yeah,
house.
yeah. Make sure to include the billiards room. Now
I
the
will.
podcast money's coming in.
But which billiards room? Well, you're coming to my house, Jordan, in about a month's time. So we
I
could get,
am.
at some point, if we get the old fire pit out, we can give the
Oh,
toasting
you've
fork a
got a
whirl.
fire pit. That makes so much more sense now.
Yeah. Well, actually, I already own 8 toasting forks.
Do you actually?
Yeah. But let me
Of course,
but let me
you do.
but let me explain. It's because my friends Lizzie and Alex, who was a guest on episode 13, came to my house in January, and I really like toasting marshmallows and I like having fires. So I thought, obviously, they go together. In fact, obviously, the first one is sort of requires a second one. And I got a fire pit for my birthday, which was earlier in January. And when they were here, I said, let's toast some marshmallows on the fire. And I said first, let's have the fire. Then I said, let's toast some marshmallows on the fire. But I didn't have a toasting fork. So now you're thinking, how have you gone from having none to having 8 and now a
I am.
ninth one on the way? Sounds like I'm with child, but
9 forks and counting.
but we improvised. So the first night they were here, we had the fire and we used, I think I had a wooden fork, which one of us used, and I had a wooden straw, and then I had a pipe cleaner. And we a very short pipe cleaner about 9 inches long, and we used those and they proved not to work very well. So I went back inside and I got a great big kitchen knife and stuck a marshmallow on the end of that and used that as a toasting fork. And then I said, maybe I should buy some toasting forks on Amazon Prime so they'll arrive tomorrow, and then tomorrow evening we can do this properly. And the first listing on Amazon that caught my eye was, I think it was 8 toasting forks for £8, which I thought was weirdly cheap. And they arrived the next day in their own little bag, like that, like the kind of bag that you put Scrabble tiles in.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
And they're telescopic. So when they arrived, we had 8 of them. So we were able to have one in each hand, like 2 each. And they, full length, they're probably about 4 feet long.
That's cool.
And they can track down to maybe 1 foot. But they're quite cheap things, obviously. I mean,
Yeah.
literally, they're cheap, and also they feel cheap, and they're made out of cheap material. But then I'm going to have this lovely, ornate, antique, 3-pronged toasting fork as well. They can do 3 marshmallows in one go.
I'm excited to see it in person.
Mm. And it might be really valuable because it looks like dear old Linda's just clearing out her house and wants to get rid of it. Maybe it's worth £1 million. And if you want to buy it from me for £1 million, email. Anyway, I think it's about time that we say that our guest today is Robert Van de Weyer. Robert Van de Weyer. Yes, that's right, Jordan. It's Robert Van de Weyer. He's from Cambridge, or he lives in Cambridge anyway. And he has done lots of interesting things. He has been a university lecturer, lecturing in economics. He and his wife ran a sort of Christian community in Little Gidding that did a lot of work with people suffering from mental health issues. He did that for nearly 20 years. He's an Anglican minister, and he's also an author and has written quite a lot of books, including one award-winning book. So yes, I've probably talked enough about toasting forks. There's been enough introduction, so I think we can hand over now to Robert and me and Jordan again. Can't we, Jordan?
Yeah, I think we can. Come on, take our hands, listeners. Let's go.
Whee! Normally, we start by going back to the start and asking what was the kind of context early on in your life?
Well, I grew up, first of all, in St John's Wood, not far from Lord's Cricket Ground, and then we moved up the hill to Hampstead. The background to that is that my father was part of the landed gentry and owned a stately home in Dorset, and that's where he grew up. Well, he grew up there and then inherited the stately home in 1946, and I was born in 1950. But my mother refused to live in the stately home. She said it was horrible, and she'd grown up in London anyway. So she insisted that father moved. So the stately home was sold in 1946, and the family moved to London, and that's where I grew up.
What was the stately home?
It was called Cliffe, Clyffe, and is about 7 or 8 miles east of Dorchester.
Oh, that wouldn't be too far because my family live near Bournemouth.
Oh, right. Okay. Quite near
Yeah.
Bournemouth. Yeah.
Yeah. Oh.
And when it was sold in 1946, it was sold to a school for the blind. So it became a school. As I say, that's where my father grew up and inherited. But I only visited it as an outsider. So it wasn't part of my life. But my mother came from a legal family in London. She grew up in the Temple area of London. And her father was a distinguished barrister who was knighted for his services to the law. He was also legal advisor to Winston Churchill.
Oh, wow.
And we have a book which Churchill signed, given to my grandfather as a sort of recognition of legal services. So that's a nice sort of heirloom that we've got. So that's the background there of my parents.
So could you explain for some of our listeners might not know what it means to be part of the landed gentry?
Yes.
What does that mean exactly?
Well, the landed gentry are those who traditionally owned the land. Most of the land in England was owned by gentlefolk, upper-class people, in other words, and it was their main source of income. So grandfather not only owned the stately home, he owned the land of the parish and all the houses. So what he owned was effectively a home and a village, and the people in that parish were his tenants, and he took money from them. So that's how the system of agriculture worked in those far-off days. The gentry owned the land and the ordinary people farmed it, either as tenant farmers or as employees.
So it doesn't necessarily mean that you had a title.
No, it didn't. Father didn't have a title, although we're connected with quite a lot of families that do. So, for example, the Earl of Leicester, who owns Holcombe near Wells-on-the-Sea in Norfolk, is my first cousin once removed, something like that. So the aristocracy tends to breed within itself. So once you're related to one bit of it, you get related to the whole lot. My grandmother came from an aristocratic family in Ireland, Viscount Portscourt, and they owned more than just a parish. At one stage, they owned large chunks of County Wicklow in Ireland, near Dublin. And I remember one occasion staying with them in the early 1960s. They were all drunkards and were running out of money. And I have a vivid recollection of the Viscount. We were sitting on the terrace having tea, and the Viscount waved towards the Wicklow Mountains and said, "I'm having to sell those mountains to afford to keep the house up." So he owned a mountain range at one point, drank his way through it.
When you were a child, what did you imagine yourself doing when you were grown up?
Nothing in particular is the answer to that. When I was aged 11, 12, 13, that sort of age, I got to know a family friend very well. He was called Aidan, and he had been a spy in the Middle East, having learnt Arabic and Farsi fluently. He was a spy in that area protecting our oil installations, and then came back and lived a kind of hippie existence, but before his time. He did all sorts of odd jobs. He worked for the railways. He washed up at the Ritz, anything that came by. He loved meeting people, meeting all sorts of people. So his main criterion was finding interesting jobs with interesting people attached to them. And he was a devout Roman Catholic and saw his life as partly evangelistic, bringing people to God. And I used to go and see him every Saturday. I loved him. And he was the first person to treat me seriously and really want to listen to what I had to say, which is, for a young boy of 13, is wonderfully encouraging that somebody actually listens to your madcap views. Then, very sadly for me, he contracted cancer of the kidney and died. And I went to see him for the last time about 3 days before he died. And his advice to me, which I followed, is don't try and have a successful life, have an interesting one. And part of the background to that is if you do have an interesting life, the one way it always works is getting to know and liking people, because it's people that provide interest. And so I love people. I love meeting people. I love chatting to them, all those kinds of things. And so that adage, don't try and be successful, but have an interesting life, has stayed with me. So my ambition, as you've just asked, aged 18, let's say, was to have an interesting life. And that's taken me in all sorts of directions.
So what was the first step that you took once you'd reached adulthood?
Well, when I'd finished A-level at the age of 17, I was, as I say, wondered what to do. Out of fealty to my father, I applied to Magdalen, Cambridge. He had been a student there. And I went out for the interview in October 1968. Yeah, probably that's right. And the whole thing seemed like public school all over again, with sort of communal facilities and a regimented life, and mixing with the upper classes. They offered me a place, not because I had any academic merit, but because, and he was quite plain about this, the senior tutor, "You're the right type," he said, meaning suitably upper class and so forth. And my uncle and father had been there, so that was another reason. And so I was driving back down in my Hillman Imp and got to Royston and had a sudden vision, as it were, that smacked me, that said, "You've got to abandon all this and leave it." So I wrote to the senior tutor of Magdalen and said I wouldn't accept his offer. I then decided I would try and get a job. And the first job I got through an agency was in what seemed to be a hotel behind Victoria Coach Station. I won't mention the name.
I don't like the term "what seemed to be."
Well, indeed, that's what I'm getting to. And when I got there to be interviewed by the manager, he said, "Do you realize this is a brothel? Are you happy to be the night porter here?" And I thought, wonderful. 17-year-old finally finding a night porter in a brothel. So I said, yes, that's great. And so I got £11 a week and served most nights through the night. It liked to think of itself as a high-class establishment, and my main job was to feed the ladies through the night, keep them well fed. It was a great job. And so when I eventually, 2 or 3 years later, became a Christian, one of the attractions was that Jesus mixed freely with prostitutes. There wasn't some respectable overseer saying, you don't mix with those types. He mixed with everybody. And that seemed to me a wonderfully attractive facet. And then I became a butler in a stately home. I thought that would be rather fun. And
Quite a jump, isn't it?
Quite a jump. Well,
Yeah.
Yes and no.
I mean, there's transferable skills there, I'm sure.
Indeed.
And probably something that you'd have been happier to tell your parents about.
I think that's right. I think they'd abandoned hope in me by then. And so it was in Yorkshire, went up to Yorkshire. This particular family, the money was running out, and to keep the roof on, they organised shooting parties during the pheasant shooting season. So people would come to shoot pheasants and pay a lot of money for the privilege. And so I was butler to this revolving group of people staying in this house. And I enjoyed it. I liked the art of actually laying the table well, waiting at table. A butler's day is very long. I had to get up at 6:30 to make tea, early morning tea for the people in their rooms, then serve breakfast. There was a cook who cooked it, and then lunch and supper and so forth, and then continue in the evening till they said, you're not needed anymore. The art which I remembered having been buttled upon is what order to lay out the knives and forks and the glasses on the table. It would take the rest of this podcast to explain the art of that.
Yeah,
it's very complicated.
Baffles me, that whole
there's a kind of lurking logic to it, but it is a bit baffling.
What could you give us the abridged version?
The glasses which is the top right-hand corner of the place you're laying, you have 4 glasses representing the 4 different drinks you're going to have. Sort of white wine for the fish course, red wine for the main course, and so on. And I think you put them in clockwise order. I think you do. And then when you're laying the knives and forks, you lay them so that the first course, knife and fork, whatever it is at the outside, and you work inwards. And so the final course is, as it were, right into where the mat is. So that's roughly how it works.
And at this point, you were, what, 20, 21, that kind of thing?
No, I was younger than that. I was 17, 18.
Right.
I was very young. Well, going back a way, my sort of hippie bit, you're much too young to remember. Well, you couldn't remember. You probably haven't heard of the Summer of Love. Does that mean anything to you?
Yeah, sorry to make you feel old, we learnt about that in history in school.
Quite right. Anyway, the Summer of Love was mainly in San Francisco, and it was about the whole hippie thing, free love and whatnot. And there was a kind of subsidiary version in Hyde Park. It was 1967, so I was age 16, and attached myself to this subsidiary Summer of Love. So I had a wonderful summer there, and I was one of the youngest there, so I was sort of nicely looked after. There was this interest, as I'm sure you're aware from your history books, in Eastern religions. The Beatles had already been to India and so forth. So it was in the air. I decided that I wanted to go to India, see what it was all about. I mean, I'd grown up as an atheist. This religion thing was a novelty to me. I'd done religion at school, but then it was sort of chunks of the Bible, and seemed very boring. And this seemed much more alluring and interesting. So when I left school at 17, then did these odd jobs, the ultimate purpose of which was to make enough money to get myself to India and live in India for a time. And so on January the 25th, 1969, I set off overland for India and arrived 4 months later.
Overland?
Overland, yes.
All the way?
All the way. And there was no need for visas in those days. Visas didn't exist. You just turned up at a border with a passport. And that was how it worked. So I travelled through Turkey, Iran, Afghanistan, over the Khyber Pass, down into the plains of India. Wonderful journey.
Wow.
And lived for a year in India and loved it. Transformed my life. I met various religious groups in India and became very interested in Indian philosophy, very drawn to it, and came to regard myself as a Hindu. I began to have this intense sense, while I was in India, of my own guilt and unworthiness, and that my life had been bad in all sorts of ways. I mean, I remembered quite trivial incidents and felt tearful about them, and decided as a part of a cleansing process, I must go off on my own and walk through central India, as the Indian monks tend to do. They often go off on their own, live by begging, and see what happened. So I set off in central India. It was the very hot season, so it was boilingly hot. I just walked and walked and walked. And wherever I landed up that night, the nearest village, I'd go and ask for accommodation, which consisted of a bed, a rope bed in the courtyard, and then walked some more the next day. I had no money, so I had to live as a beggar, and I was always looked after generously. Heaven knows what they thought of me. And it was that sense of my own guilt and unworthiness that made having a religion intensely important. I needed to believe in something that was more than me, that I could dedicate myself to. And then I got kidney stones. It was an absolute agony. They are horrible.
I've heard they're some
and-
of the worst pain you can really have, aren't they?
They are. It was absolutely blindingly painful. It settled a bit, but I mean, I kept in touch with my parents. I mean, the agony they must have suffered, I don't know. And they insisted I came back home, and they bought an air ticket from British Airways, or whatever it was called in those days, and I came home. But having got home, I was endlessly restless. I knew I had to go back to India, and I'd got so far on the sort of Hindu road that I felt I needed a guru, a teacher of truth, somebody to guide me. And so I went back to India. I should say, in the meantime, I'd met the girl who I'd been married to for the last half century, Sarah, and we went together to India on that occasion. I mean, she was much less clear about this guru thing than I was, but she was very happy to be. We were happy to be with each other. I mean, I'm utterly devoted to her, and have been all these years. So I arrived in India in search of a guru. I had a feeling that the guru would be in South India. I didn't know why I had that feeling. So we travelled off to South India on the train. We were on this particular sort of little branch line, and we met a man called Philippos. And he asked us what we were doing, and we said, looking for a guru. He said, I got the very guru for you. And I'll take you to him. So instead of getting off at whatever station he wanted to, he went with us to this guru. And the guru, or the group that was there, belonged to this very ancient South Indian church that claims to date itself back to St. Thomas. And here was a community in the middle of this rural area of South India, where they had an ashram, which is the community around a guru, and the guru, believe it or not, was Christ. So they were Christa Sishya Ashram, the ashram of the disciples of Christ the Guru. And this was sort of eye-opener. He was sort of mixing Christianity, which I despised, with Hinduism, which I loved. It was a mind-boggling thought. And then on the first evening, the leader of the community, the Acharya he's called, said, I think that God wants you to be here for several months, and you're very welcome. And I replied, well, you can't possibly welcome me. I'm not married, so living with an unmarried woman would be scandal. And I don't believe in God, and you're a godly community, so you can't possibly want me. And he said, oh, well, God will sort all that out. That's no problem. and as you can imagine, to a young man as I was, again, that was a mind-blowing answer, that I didn't have to conform. I didn't have to be good. They would accept me as I was. And so we lived there. I think we started living there in about June of 1970, something like that, and a bit later. And we helped in the fields. They had rice fields, and we helped with all that. And we had our own little hut. And there was one particular member of the community who was he was illiterate, but loved hearing people read the Bible to him. And he said to us, you need a Bible. And I said, well, we don't have a Bible, and no way of getting one. Well, he set off on a journey at his own expense, and he was very poor, to a town some many miles away, where he knew there was a Christian bookshop. He bought a Bible, brought it back to us, said, here's your Bible, read it from cover to cover. And this wonderful, wonderful man, Jacob, There we are. That's a good name. Uh,
Oh.
I read the Bible. It was the New Testament. I started at Matthew and ended at Revelation. And by the time I got to about Mark's Gospel, I was completely in love with Christ, with the figure of Jesus Christ as he emerges from the pages of the New Testament. I still didn't believe in God, and didn't think and Jacob said to me, "You don't need to believe in God. When you read the word God, think of the perfect human being. That's all you need to think of, and all the rest will sort itself out." So I read the Bible as an atheist, as it were, effectively discounting all the stuff about God and encountering the person of Christ, and not having to worry about doctrines and beliefs and God and all that sort of thing, made me able to look at Christ in a new way. He was no longer somebody encapsulated at school by the chaplain. Here he was as a living figure to me. And on Christmas Day, 1970, I got up very early, long before dawn, and I'll tell you a little story before that. A few days before Christmas on that year, 1970, the nearby village, about a mile from the ashram, they held Christmas celebrations. Although they were although they were a Hindu village, they regarded Christ as a great exemplar, and they loved the stories of his stories, and they loved the Christmas story. So throughout the village, every little mud house had a star, little paper star they would have. And because they assumed I was Christian, wrongly, they invited me to come and sing Christmas songs. So Sarah and I went along to the temple and sang Once in Royal David City, while shepherds watched and so on. And after each one, they would clap. And then at the end, I sang the song I Believe, which was a hit in those days. And as I sang it, I had this sense I almost did believe that I sang the song I Believe and had this hugely heavy sense that I almost believed. And then on Christmas Day, very early, as I was saying, I went into the Christian temple they had in the ashram, and there was a cross and so on, and I knelt down and committed my life to Christ as my guru, as my teacher. Still didn't believe in God, but he was going to be my teacher and show me what I needed to know. But I was still, in my sort of arrogance, I couldn't say it wasn't a total commitment. I said, I'll commit myself for 6 months. I'll obey everything you say for 6 months and then see what'll happen.
On a rolling contract.
A rolling contract, exactly. And one of the things I realized that Christ absolutely insisted you did. So I was, he was my guru, I had to do it because I was in obedience to him, was praying. So I began to go out each evening into the sort of hot dusk of the paddy fields and say very slowly the Lord's Prayer. Teach us to pray, here it is. And at first I assumed I was praying into nothing. And then gradually I sensed there was somebody at the other end, as it were, and the prayers began to be answered. And I thought, maybe there is a God. Maybe God is real. And that became me. I decided he is real. And I became a God-believing Christian. But the thing that's remained with me crucially is I was first of all a disciple of Christ as my guru. And so ever since then, and that's over 50 years ago, when I've gone through a bad patch, I've thought I need to go back to the beginning, to Christ as my guru, and not worry about anything else, just obey him. And that's always worked.
So when you had this change of heart, going to being a God-believing Christian, a God-believing follower of Christ, did that create any change in your relationship to the people that you were staying with in this community?
It did, yes. I felt I was probably one of them as opposed to a visitor. And we were tempted to settle there and just live our lives as part of the community. But it didn't ultimately feel quite right. So eventually we returned home.
And where was home? Was that London when you returned? Or
Well, no, I haven't lived in London since I left to go and work in the brothel. No, what we did when we came back, I decided I needed to spend time studying Christianity. Having become a Christian, I needed to understand what I just become. And Sarah had taken a year off from her degree at Durham University to come with me to India and needed to finish it, the degree. And so what we did is we bought for £25 a derelict miner's cottage up in the hills of County Durham.
for £25.
£25, yeah. It was in fairly poor condition, but the whole village where we were living had a colliery which had closed down, so the economy had collapsed,
Mhm.
and the only remaining inhabitants were elderly people. And anyway, we settled there, and I bought an A40 car, which is a sort of ancient car that I eventually walked. My foot went through the floor. It rusted away. And every day we motored into Durham. I went to the library and read and read and read and read on Christianity. And Sarah finished her degree.
So after Sarah finished her degree,
Well,
what was next?
what was next was Ethiopia. And we always like,
Oh, wow.
wow, where we spent a year. All this studying that I did of Christianity, one of the things about Christianity is there's so many different traditions within it, so many different styles of Christianity. And if you become a Christian from nowhere, as it were, you adopt a style. Either it's the one of the church that happened to welcome you in the first place, or it's something you to discover. And so in this reading that I was doing, I discovered monasticism and how important it had been in the history of the church. And I felt very drawn to the Christian monastic tradition, the Desert Fathers, the monks who lived in the desert of Egypt and Syria. The kind of romance of that was very appealing. And we decided, but we were already failures. We were married. We had got married in the meantime, and so we couldn't be a monk or nun ourselves because we were married. So the question was how to be part of the monastic tradition without being a monk or a nun. And we had the idea of, at some stage, forming some sort of Christian ashram in England, but we needed to understand how that might work. And in the monastic tradition, there's the Western, sort of West Europe tradition, which is monasteries are very splendid, solid buildings, and the monks live very orderly and communal lives. They sleep in dormitories and eat together and so on. And it's very regimented. Every minute of the day, there's something you're supposed to be doing. And that seemed something incompatible with family life. And we intended to have children at some point. Whereas the Eastern tradition, which doesn't mean Hinduism, means the sort of Middle Eastern tradition, Eastern Orthodoxy, the monasteries of the Middle East were much more flexible. They were based on the monasteries of the Desert Fathers, the original Christian monks, where people came out from the cities and initially just established themselves as hermits. But then, Christianity being what it is, groups of hermits came together to live in community. There was a bunch of people living alone, as it were. And by about the year 250, there were quite a lot of these communities. But they were very flexible. They were like villages where each monk had a little hut, and then there was a central church and a kitchen. And each monk participated in the life of the community as much or as little as he wanted. So it was flexible. I mean, that was part of its genius. And as I say, we thought Ethiopia was the place where we might actually encounter this in something like its original form. And so we set off for Ethiopia in the late summer of 1972. It was quite a difficult journey. There were no commercial flights into Ethiopia. So we had to go overland from Nairobi into Addis Ababa, which is about 1,000 miles. And there were no roads to speak of. There were tracks through the jungle. So it was rather like sort of Livingstone in Darkest Africa. And so we spent several months getting to Addis. Well, I think several is perhaps an exaggeration, but certainly 3 or 4 months. And having hacked our way or found our way through the jungle. And then we began to inquire about, when we arrived in Addis, news quickly got round that this strange white people had turned up, because white faces were very unusual. The patriarch of Ethiopia heard about this, and heard that we were interested in studying monasteries, and he invited us to his palace. So we went to be blessed by the patriarch, and he gave us a letter of introduction. Just to go off at a momentary tangent, he was later, in 1979, a martyr to the communist regime that took over Ethiopia. He was killed by wire being tied around his neck. Anyway, that's
What was so the patriarch, was he like the monarch of Ethiopia?
he was the head of the Ethiopian church. There was the emperor.
Oh, I see. In like the
Right.
Eastern Orthodox Church.
Yeah, that's right. So
Oh,
the emperor
like
was
like a pope in a
he was
way.
like a
so
pope. He was the pope. He was the pope. He was the local pope. And his palace, which is actually little more than a little house, was next to the palace where Haile Selassie, the emperor, lived.
Oh, wow.
And so we were introduced to this patriarch who had, in this sort of large bare room with a seat in the middle, and he sat on the seat. It was raised slightly. And as I say, he blessed us and gave us a letter of introduction. And we asked him for a map or directions to all the monasteries that were in the country. And he said, there are no maps. The country is unmapped. You're going to have to find these monasteries for yourself using local guides. He confessed that that's how he found his way around his monasteries. This vast country with monasteries was by finding local guides when he made a visitation. So we adopted a policy to find the monasteries of talking to wandering monks, of which there were many, and if three monks gave the same directions across the mountains to the same named monastery, we would set out and see if we could find it. So it was all mountainous areas, so it was very high up, and we just set off across the mountains, picking up local guides as we could. And over the course of a year, slightly less than a year, we visited and stayed in about 20 monasteries and got a very vivid picture of their way of life. They were often in the most spectacular locations. There was one monastery which was there was a sheer cliff, about 1,000 feet, 300 meters, and there was a ledge about 3 or 4 meters wide, and the monastery was situated on this ledge. And you got to the ledge by going from the top down into the monastery, and many centuries ago they'd carved a kind of funnel down to the monastery, and so you put your back on one side of the funnel and you climb down with your feet and hands, gradually letting yourself down. So we had walked for about 3 or 4 days finding this place, and then we had to have this terrifying way of getting into it. And then we got to the bottom. The abbot welcomed us, and but then they looked quizzically at Sarah, and they were. She looked like a boy in that she had short hair, but she had bosoms, and this perplexed them. And eventually, they asked us whether she was a boy or a girl, and so we had to let on. And so they, in the nicest possible way, they directed her to go back up the chimney and stay at the top. But they treated her like royalty. They brought cups of tea, and eventually overnight they made a little tent for her to live in. They had constant guards looking after her, so there was no deprivation. And they said, we never have female cats. Even was one of their remarks. No females allowed. And so they were, as always, they were very gracious. So that was one spectacular location. But as I say, the hut, they didn't have, like you have at monasteries in the West, sort of big, huge, great imposing buildings. The huts were smaller versions of the peasants' huts that people lived all over the place. Oh, there was another monastery we went to, thinking of spectacular places. There was a thumb of rock and sheer on all sides, about 100, 200 meters high. They let you down and lifted you up in a basket. So you arrived at the bottom and you climbed into this basket and they pulled you up. So most of the monasteries had, as I say, fairly spectacular locations, but their way of life and then their appearance was very ordinary. I mean, that was a striking thing. Incidentally, just to go off at another tangent, the churches in monasteries were round, usually, and it was an ancient way of building. They had wood and stone in alternate courses, and they were round so that the worship within the church was in the round. It wasn't like serried ranks as we have. It was all looking towards each other, and with the altar in the middle. So yeah, we all sorts of insights we learned from that. One of which has remained very firmly in my mind is we arrived at this particular monastery while they were in the business of electing a new abbot. And I should say, monasticism in Christianity is the only bit of Christianity that has been, over the centuries, democratic as opposed to hierarchical. They vote their leaders. Anyway, there was this election going on, and it was a very peculiar campaign because the monks had two principles. If somebody wants to be abbot, they shouldn't be abbot. If somebody wants power, they shouldn't be allowed to wield it. That was one principle. The other is value love above competence. But it led to an odd campaign because the senior monks that thought they might get elected, but recoiled from that idea, went round saying, please don't vote for me. But also those who secretly harboured ambitions to be abbot also went round saying, please don't vote for me, to appear to be humble. So everybody was going around saying, please don't vote for me. And there was no way of telling who was sincere and who was a fraud. And then when on the election day, there was an elderly monk had a chair and a table just outside the church. And monks came and whispered their vote into his ear, and he totted them up. And then when the winner was declared at dusk, they immediately set upon him and arrested him and took him to a special cell where they had a huge padlock and padlocked him in. And the point was that the fear is that if he wasn't captured and arrested, he would run off, not wanting to be abbot. And in fact, anyone wanting to be abbot would run off. So he was put in this cell, and only when he had been there for several days did they let him out with his hand on the Bible, saying, I promise to fulfill my duties as abbot. So a real election, a real Christian election. How different to how things work in our churches.
Yeah.
And then another feature is they regarded living as a hermit as the ultimate form of Christian life, the finest, where you could devote yourself entirely to God. On one occasion, we were below a mountain where there was a monastery at the top, and there were lots and lots of holes in the mountain, as it were, where hermits lived. And so you looked up at the hill, and there were lots and lots of hermits. And when we walked past them, we waved, and some waved back, and some didn't. And they were fed by monks at the top, lowering down. Well, the only food they had was bread, actually. So each week they lowered down a chunk of bread to a hermit, who then took it, and that was his diet for the rest of the week. And when the hermit died, the way you knew he died or was impossibly ill was nobody took the bread anymore. But if you were a hermit, you had no material luxuries at all, and that included a funeral. So there were no funerals for hermits. What happened when they concluded that a hermit had died is a monk was let down just to check, and then the body was allowed to decompose. And when it had been reduced to just bones, it was put in one corner of the cave, and then rather neatly folded up, and then a new hermit could move in. And
with the bones still in the corner.
With the bones still so they're in a corner. And we were obviously interested to see this, so we were let down on a basket, one by one, to go into the cave. And there was indeed a human skeleton all folded up and wrapped up and in one corner. And it had just been, as it were, got ready for the next hermit who was going to move in a day or two.
If you hadn't been married, would that lifestyle have appealed to you, do you think?
It was too cold. No, it didn't have the same appeal as India for some reason. We learnt a lot from Ethiopia, and we captured something of its spirit, but we never identified with it in the way that we did with India. So if we were ever to travel to our former destinations again, it would be to India we'd go.
So how long were you in Ethiopia for?
We were there for just under a year. I mean, researching the monasteries, getting directions to them, and visiting them and staying with them was a slow business. And I wrote it up. The first thing I'd ever published, I wrote up a description of an Ethiopian monastery that you can still find on the internet. If you type in Ethiopian Church Van de Weyer, my surname, I think that'll take you to the slot where my description is.
Well, you've written many books, haven't you?
I have indeed.
How many books have you published?
About 50. And
50, wow.
My first book was called Guru Jesus, My Conversion to Christianity, through the whole hippie thing. And that was a mini bestseller, I'm proud to say, and had a sort of cult of its own. Well, cult's a silly word, but it had a little niche.
Following,
that's, yeah. And the idea of mixing Hinduism with Christianity was quite attractive at the time. I mean, I think times move on, so it doesn't have the same cachet now.
So where did you, when you came back to England,
well, we then decided that we wanted to start a family, and I would need to earn a living, which is not a welcome thought, and knew that I'm totally unbusinesslike. So I went to do a degree, and I chose economics as the subject of the degree, partly because I'm genuinely interested in it, but partly because I knew I could earn a living one way or another. Whereas if I did philosophy, as you did, it's not a great money spinner.
No.
So, and we decided we wanted to live in the north of England at that stage. So I applied to Lancaster University, and we bought a house for the grand total of £4,500. Inflation was rampant in Lancaster, and commuted to the university each day. I studied economics for 3 years and emerged with a good result. Then the opportunity came to move in this direction to a place called Little Gidding, which some of your listeners will have heard of. It was the site in the early 16th century of a kind of family community, a sort of commune. And we had the opportunity to raise money for a charity to buy the land around the ancient church of Little Gidding. And we moved there. We built some houses, and our intention was to form some kind of Christian commune based on the Ethiopian model. Needless to say, what we as human beings want to do and want to achieve almost never are achieved. It's things that happen to us that are the most constructive. And what emerged at Little Gidding wasn't the kind of wonderful utopian community that I had envisaged, albeit based on Ethiopia, but an actually very effective way of helping people with chronic mental illness. And so what emerged was a kind of extended hostel for people needing to a safe environment in which to handle anxiety, depression, schizophrenia, whatever it might be. And so we spent the best part of 20 years running this community that was mainly for people with difficulties of one kind or another. And we were perpetually broke. So I used to come into Cambridge and lecture in economics and then go back again to milk the cow. Well, I didn't milk the cow, Sarah did. And we had all sorts of livestock. We had cows, we had donkeys. The most therapeutic animal is a donkey. We acquired 2 donkeys from the Huntingdon Research Centre, which had and used them for testing of drugs and so forth. And these donkeys were deemed to be past it. And so they came to us. And they had an astonishing ability to enable people to pour out their problems to the donkeys, and the donkeys would seem to absorb them. If you've ever had intimate contact with a donkey, you'll know exactly what I mean. They are most wonderful creatures.
Yes, I when I lived in Ireland, up the road there was a donkey in a field next to someone's house, and when you went past, it would come up to the fence, and
say hello.
I became fond of it. Yes, I think donkey's probably my favourite animal, other than cats and dogs.
Right. I think I'm the same. I like donkeys. And so that's what emerged. And as I say, we spent 20 years doing that. And sometimes people were seemingly miraculously cured. There's one girl who was dying of anorexia and bulimia, and used to go down in the dairy and drink all the milk and then sick it up. So you go down to the dairy in the morning to find her vomit all over the place. And we despaired. We thought it was just a matter of weeks. But then something happened in that context. And one moment she was ill, the next moment she was better. And she went off to do some job and got married. And I could recount quite a lot of stories of that kind that makes me think that our treatment of mental illness, we understand so little of what mental illness really is, but our treatment of it doesn't feel right. And I think that safe environment is nearer what's needed. But I'm no expert on that, so that's only a feeling. Staying with that for a moment, in the past, our mental hospitals were huge, great barrackses and very regimented. And then opinion about mental illness changed, and those great, big, old-fashioned mental asylums were closed down. But actually, I mean, Sarah worked in one of them for a year or two up in Lancaster, and they provided a safe environment. And I suspect they were more effective than the kind of care in the community homes that we have now for people with serious mental illness. And Sarah's impression was that the regimented nature of life in those places and the fact that it's all-encompassing and it's safe actually enabled a greater level of cure to happen. These are big matters.
Mm. So you said it was a couple of decades that you were running that
Yes.
commune, I guess. What would you call it, a commune? Or,
Yeah, well, I'm happy to call it a commune. Yeah.
So it must have been quite an adjustment to have been on the Little Gidding community for 20 years and then to go and do something else.
Well, yes, it was a difficult time because the strain of running a community with people with mental problems ultimately became too much. And Sarah got to a point where she couldn't stand it much longer, and I was having a sort of mini breakdown. So the circumstances forced us to withdraw. And as you're right, that was quite painful. And I settled down to writing more books, which I love doing. So that was okay. Sarah had already trained as an occupational therapist, and she was working in Peterborough, so that was okay. So we kind of muddled through. And then grandchildren arrived, and we became very participating grandparents. And we've just had enough money to get by. We're not short of money, but we haven't got much surplus. So it'll probably see us out, as they say. I've been a lecturer, part-time always, at what's now the Anglia University, what's called the Tech in those days. But I'm actually the opposite of an academic. An academic knows a lot about a little. So you can be the expert on spiders or something. My mind's the very opposite of that. I like to know a little about a lot. So I'm a non-academic. But living in Cambridge, you can't help but sort of encounter academic life. So I do. But the area of economics where I've made some modest contribution is probably green economics. Long ago, when it was unfashionable back in the 80s, I wrote 2 books on green economics, one more academic than the other. I don't think they had any particular impact, but they were fast. They came, I was doing it before it was fashionable to write about that topic. Essentially, a green approach to economics, or one part of a green approach, would be the producer pays for the pollution he's causing. But that's essentially a free market solution. You impose a cost on the producer equal to you impose a tax on the producer equal to the pollution he's causing in value, and that gives him an incentive to pollute less. So rather than saying the government should decide everything, you're creating a playing field in which the incentives are such that it works in the way you want it to.
Is the levying of that tax not a statist solution, though?
Well, it's a market solution, recognizing that markets don't always work perfectly, but rather than the state taking things over, the state adjusts the incentive patterns in the right way. So a tax is a way of adjusting the incentives. The producer pays for the pollution, therefore he pollutes less. And that's a way of harnessing the profit motive. You change the way in which profit is calculated and deemed. To give an example of that, renewable energy. It will never work so long as it depends on government subsidy, because that's puts an imposition on government and so on. And it will never work if you put taxes on users, because that's ordinary people. It'll only work if renewable energy becomes cheaper to produce than fossil fuel energy. Once we can achieve that, then you don't need any more incentives. People will move to renewable energy simply for the desire for profit. So make it profitable, and then it'll happen. Rather than saying these profits are bad, you say, well, let's use the profit motive in the right way, and then they won't be bad.
Yeah, and I think as well for the average family, you think to yourself, well, why should I have to pay for it when me and my family aren't really the big problem here?
Yes,
You know?
exactly. Yes.
Yeah, why am I being lumped with the bill when you look at these big corporations and businesses that are producing that are causing way more of a problem than I ever could.
Yes. But let's imagine if I were in charge of green policy, my entire efforts would be to new technology that was meant that good energy was cheaper than bad energy to produce. So let's imagine, as a thought experiment, that the Littlemore research establishment in California, which is the most advanced research establishment for nuclear fusion, came up with a nuclear fusion device that produced clean energy at a fraction or at a lower cost than fossil fuels. We could then sit back. The problem of climate change would solve itself, because people would say, gosh, much cheaper to use nuclear fusion than fossil fuels. I'll go for that. And that's the way we'll save the planet. Create technologies that do the right thing, that are cheaper than fossil fuels. And then the market will do the rest.
Well, let's move on to the subject of your entering the priesthood or the Church of England.
Yes. Well, the first thing was, having come back from India and then gone to Ethiopia, having come back from there, we felt we needed to join a church, a congregation primarily, because that's part of being a Christian, is you belong to a community of Christians. And in my studies at the Durham University Library, I looked at the claims of all the different denominations, Roman Catholic, Eastern Orthodox, Lutheran, Anglican, whatever, and I concluded that none of the special claims were valid, that the Roman Catholic Church declares that it's the one true church, and I concluded that was rubbish. So therefore, the choice of church was one of some kind of preference rather than absolute truth. The reason why eventually I chose the Church of England is that culturally, I felt at that time the greatest affinity with it of any church. Insofar as I'd had any religious background at all, it was C of E, public school worship and so on, and going to matins with Granny in Dorchester. And I loved the language of the Old Book of Common Prayer. That was part of the sort of English tradition. And I loved the fact in those days that most parish churches, Anglican churches, were deeply embedded in their local community. So you had that fusion of church and community. So I became Church of England, and I got confirmed in the Church of England in 1974, I think. And the one bit of advice I remember from the confirmation training was that in a confirmation, the bishop lays his hands on the head of the confirmand, and the advice that we were given, and I was the one grown up amongst lots of adolescent boys and girls, the advice that we boys were given was, don't use Brill cream on your head, because that'll come off on the bishop's hands and you'll find it revolting. So that was my one bit of confirmation training I can still remember. Don't smart your hair down with Brill cream, which is grease, essentially. So I became C of E, and then the Bishop of Ely, who I liked very much, summoned me one day and suggested I become a clergyman. And I said I couldn't possibly do that, because I got this job teaching economics. I'm running the Little Gidding community. I couldn't possibly also train for the priesthood. And he stared into space for a bit, and said, I think I'll let you off the training. You just do one summer school, and that'll be fine. You know enough theology already. Anyway, you can always mug it up. And so without training, or with virtually no training, he ordained me. And so I blame him. And if I could have my life over again, I wouldn't have got ordained. I think I was persuaded, but I think I could have served Christ better as a layperson than a clergyman. I think what we need in the church is not more clergy wearing dog collars. We need lay people who are truly dedicated to Christ. They're a much more powerful witness, and I would have been a better witness to Christ if I had just been a layperson, or a deacon perhaps, but not a priest.
So, for any of our listeners who might have absolutely no idea what a Christian priest does, what the job description is, could you explain?
Well, thereby hangs a bit of a tale, really. Having been ordained, I asked that same question myself. What should I be doing as a priest? I spoke to lots and lots of priests, and the main thing they did was sit on committees. And
That makes it sound very boring.
It is very boring. Even if they were a country priest with sort of 10 parishes in their care, still most of their time would be spent on committees. And it seemed to me that very little time was spent by the clergy on doing what I would regard as God's business. And I subsequently asked clergyman after clergyman, what do you do each day? What do you do from 9 in the morning to 6 in the evening, or whatever it is, your working day? And in all these years, I've asked umpteen clergy that question, and none has given me an answer that makes me think clergy are a good thing. I mean, the one thing that in the Church of England that clergymen can do that other people can't do is celebrate the Holy Communion. But I think that's just a custom. I would have no objection to Jacob celebrating the Holy Communion, regardless of whether he's ordained or not. I would say, go for it. So I'm sort of not so much anti-clerical as aclerical.
So, have you considered becoming a lay person again and resigning your orders, or whatever the phrase is?
I have thought about that. I think about it quite a lot. The thing that inhibits me is, as a priest, I'm moderately useful in the church in Cambridge where I serve. But I also have a ministry in a Baptist church in Stamford, and they couldn't care less whether I'm ordained or not ordained. I could continue that ministry there anyway. So it is in my mind there's two related things in my mind. One is to give up my priesthood, and the other, and this needs a bit of background to explain it. Most people will have heard of a church called a Baptist church. Now, in the Church of England and most churches, baptism, the spreading of water, is done when a child is aged nothing. It's a sort of hello child ritual. In the Baptist churches, they only have baptism, the putting of water on the person, when that person is grown up and can make a mature commitment to faith. I was baptized aged 1 in St. John's Wood, can't remember it, and before I die, I want to be baptized as an adult, and that would involve me every Baptist church has a tank under the floor, and they lift up the floorboards, fill it with water, and you're baptized by total immersion, as they call it. And I want to have that before I die. But if I had it now, I would be breaching my vows as a priest in the Church of England, because I'd be effectively saying Church of England baptism is not enough. So those are my two ecclesiastical ambitions, to give up being a priest and to be baptized by total immersion.
So for you, would that feel like you'd sort of taken it back into your own hands and you'd made that decision yourself?
Yeah. Yes, that's a very good way of putting it. Yeah, exactly that. I take it back in my own hands. So when you read in the papers I've been sacked as a priest in the Church of England, you'll know what's happened.
You heard it here first, listeners.
You heard it first on your podcast.
So tell us what you do, or what you have done, and what you currently do as a priest.
Well, for about 30 years, I was unpaid priest of a tiny village in Huntingdonshire. So that was on top of all these other things I was doing. One thing I did is every few years I would visit every house in the village to make sure I knew everybody. And I took services. I went to visit the sick, obviously, and took services. I didn't sit on any committees. I didn't involve myself on any kind of bureaucratic thing. I just did my job as a priest, visiting and conducting worship. And I did that for 30 years in that particular village. And then we felt we'd done enough and moved into Cambridge, which is only 12 years ago. So I served that parish unpaid for, as I say, 30 years. And having moved into Cambridge 12 years ago, we attached ourselves to a church in the centre, which at that time was fairly derelict. Plaster was falling off the ceiling and water was pouring in through a sort of hole in the ceiling as well as everywhere else. And we felt a very strong sense that God was calling us to this church, which is even odder given that the style of worship in that church, St. Clement's, is what's called very high church, which means lots of ritual, incense being swung, clergymen dressed up in highly coloured robes, all that kind of thing. That's not really our bag. We're not interested in, I'm not, well, no, so is Sarah. We like things much simpler. But we felt this calling to this church and to accept that style of worship. And it's been absolutely wonderful. God has blessed us in so many different ways. And the church is now more or less restored, not quite. And we've raised $500,000 to restore it. The worship is not, we get a congregation about 20 or 30, that's okay. And the main thing is, for me, is that I spend most lunchtimes just sitting in the church talking to people who walk through the door. I enjoy it hugely, and I think it genuinely does some good. I mean, I find myself talking to people often in quite serious distress and able to talk things through with them, that kind of thing. So as a pastoral ministry, it is fantastic. Well, it's fantastic for me. To what extent people benefit, I can't judge. And because I feel a sense of calling to it, I don't need to judge. God's decided I'm here. It's up to him to use me as he wants.
And do you tend to find that, is it generally people who are seeking advice or they've got sort of troubles and woes in their life, or is it just people?
No, most people come into the church initially because they're visitors to Cambridge.
Yeah.
And they see this a church that's open, I'll go into it.
Mm.
Sometimes there are people who already know about us to come along, but mostly it's visitors. And it's to visitors that this ministry then develops. I mean, week by week, we often take people's emails and names so we can pray for them and keep them in touch. And week by week, and Sarah and I produce a daily letter. And week by week, we get 3, 4, 5 people writing to us, thanking us for what we've done. And that's some sort of affirmation.
I think the real Church of England is the people who often forsake their own comfort by going into poorer areas of the country, deprived areas, and doing what you might call the spade work. So not the sitting on committees, but ministering to the poor and talking to people in distress and talking to people who are sick and
yes,
visiting the sick and the widows in their affliction and those kinds of callings. So it sounds like what you've ended up doing is more towards that end, the sharp end, you might say.
Yes, I think that's absolutely right. And now I'm age 73. Nobody expects me to administer anything or to sit on any committees anyway. So, and I'm generally regarded as something of a nuisance. So the temptation's not there.
Well, if anyone is listening who wants Robert to sit on any committees, you can take this as a sign that
refusal.
He refusal. Yeah, he says no, thank you.
No, thank you. That's quite right.
So now we're moving on to the final section, which is the dream job section. And the first thing we always like to ask people is, from the jump, do you have a dream job in mind?
The job I'd like is Chancellor of the Exchequer.
Okay.
I think I could make
this
it.
Is why I love this.
I think I could have a good fist at it. I think I'd be. I look with despair at chancellors. There's things they could do so easily, and would win them applause and so on that they don't do, like reforming the tax system, which is hopelessly complex. Things like that, rather boring things, but could make a big difference. That's my dream job, Chancellor of the Exchequer. So if you could sort of arrange it, uh, uh, I would be very grateful.
The only drawback, Robert, is of course a prerequisite for being Chancellor of the Exchequer is to be a member of the House of Commons.
Yeah, I know, and I
And
don't
I'm not
fancy
sure
that.
that you would enjoy the process of becoming a member of the House of Commons or of being one
You're
for
quite
enough
right.
time to be appointed as Chancellor of the Exchequer.
You are absolutely right. So that's a flop.
Unless we were in a world where the financial privilege of the House of Commons was degraded enough that it could be tolerated that you would be in the House of Lords,
That's true. Yes,
appointed directly to it, and be the first Chancellor of the Exchequer in the House of Lords since ever, probably.
yes. Well, that's a very good arrangement. If you could fix that up, I would be even happier.
Well, this is the dream job section, so we.
So there we are.
In that case, in this scenario, then we could tinker with history a little bit, so that you were the one who, in the end, inherited the Viscountcy of Court, and you could go to the House of Lords in that capacity.
I could. That's a thought. Yeah, it's an Irish peerage. I think I'm not sure Irish peers
No,
still
they're
sit in the
not.
House of Lords.
But
that
perhaps, but some Irish peers have subsidiary British titles which enable them to.
That's
to sit
true.
there.
Yes. So you could give
So-
me a subsidiary British title.
Yes, what would that be?
Well, I spent my very happy holidays in Dorset, so I'd happily be the Earl of Dorset.
Ah,
And we'd be happy to have you, Robert.
That's very kind.
Earl of
Yeah.
Dorset, and because viscountcies are inferior to earldoms, that would
You're
mean
quite
that
right. Yes.
that would mean that your eldest son would have the courtesy title of Viscount Horscourt.
Yeah, it doesn't quite work, does it? But I'm sure we could make it work.
We could make it work, yes. Okay, so you're in the House of Lords and you stand to the dispatch box to deliver your first budget. The tradition in the House of Commons, and I presume you'd want to transfer this over, is during the budget speech, the Chancellor of the Exchequer is allowed to have a drink with him at the dispatch box, which has quite often been an alcoholic drink over
No, I'm
the years.
teetotal. It'd have to be water.
So it would have to be something else. Water. But I think you could have any drink you liked. So would you?
No-
Is there any
no
other
wa-
soft drink?
No, water would do the trick perfectly.
Oh dear. I was hoping. I was hoping for something unusual.
No, I'm my drinking habits are very usual, very
So
common.
what would be in your first budget speech?
It would be to simplify the tax code, to look for ways for reducing tax. Oh, and the third one would be we were discussing earlier, would be to adapt the tax system to the requirements of green economics, which I still feel passionate about.
Mm.
So that's a serious answer.
How long do you think you would
5
be
years.
able to sustain? 5 years. Okay.
I think within 5 years I could do most of what I wanted to do, and I could be booted out.
Back to the back benches.
Well, no, I'm in the House of Lords, remember, so I would just fade away as a peer.
So you wouldn't continue to give speeches from the back benches in the Lords?
Oh, I didn't think so, no.
No, you just go back to Cambridge.
Go back to Cambridge and spend my twilight years in this city.
And how do you think Sarah would feel about being the Countess of Dorset?
Well, I think secretly she'd be quite pleased. I mean, her background is very left-wing in that her grandfather rather, was a miners' leader in the Notts Derby coalfield back in the time of the general strike.
Oh, nice.
So she's quite a distinguished background. So her instincts are egalitarian and left-wing, but like so many people of egalitarian instincts, when the prospect of an earldom pops up, somehow their instincts wobble.
So after your 5 year, after spending a parliament as a Chancellor of the Exchequer, often the post government time for such a person would be being on the after dinner speaker circuit.
Oh no!
Maybe like George Osborne becoming the editor of a newspaper or doing something like that. Would you eschew all those baubles
would.
and things that would come afterwards.
I wouldn't be interested in the baubles. After dinner speaking is a very tedious occupation. I've done a bit of it. And I'm 73. I serve my 5 years. That takes me to 78, at which point death will be looming. So my main task will be to prepare to meet the Almighty. I think that's how we should spend our dying years, and I shall enjoy it.
And you could leave behind a beautiful legacy of green economic policy.
It would be a wonderful legacy.
Yeah.
To make your bit of changing the planet, saving the planet, would be great. And the divine thing, I think the care of the planet is a divine obligation. And people sense it. I think there's a sense that the planet is sacred, and that's a very widespread sense. So caring for the planet and helping to save it is a divine mission.
Well, I think we found it then. So
Yeah.
You have.
I think we can shake your hand on that offer of becoming the first Chancellor of the Exchequer to sit in the House of Lords.
How kind.
Well, I hope you've enjoyed it, Robert. The
I have
conversation.
indeed. Yes, I've enjoyed it hugely. And best of luck with this whole enterprise. It sounds wonderful.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's been an absolute pleasure having you, Robert.
Well,
Yeah,
thank
it's
you.
been fascinating. Well, that was extremely lovely to talk to Robert. When I moved to Cambridge back in 2018, Robert was one of the first people from Cambridge I met. And he's a very Cambridge kind of person, I think, to meet. He's one of those characters that you only meet in one of the older university cities. He's someone, right back when we started doing this, I thought he'd be great to have on. Obviously, you hadn't met him before, Jordan. What was your impression of him when you?
Well, just what a life, really.
Yeah.
I mean, that's why I love doing this, because we end up talking to people who have just done so much. And I find that, particularly with Robert, it was the way he just so casually said things about his travels. Like it wasn't even a second thought to him. It was like, oh, and then I went to India, and then I went to Africa. And it's just that personally for me is it's
and
so
traveled
crazy.
so much even within the countries as well. It's taking like a month to walk to where he was going in.
Yeah, so interesting.
Yeah, hope you enjoyed it. The next episode is out on the 1st of April, which is a bank holiday, so you've got no excuses not to listen to it. And it's, without giving away who the guest is, it's going to be our first episode recorded with someone who's abroad, and abroad with a capital A, let's just say in this case, because
yes,
that this guest is very abroad, the abroadest guest that ever abroaded.
If you look up abroad in the dictionary, it's this guest. And the good thing is with social media is that you can be abroad and you can look at it no matter where you are in the world. So I don't know, just off the top of my head, say for example, our Instagram, just off the top of my head, the Careers Mare Instagram or the Careers Mare TikTok, or the LinkedIn or the YouTube. You can view them anywhere in the world.
What about the Twitter?
The Twitter as well, and the Facebook.
My goodness.
Yeah.
This goes deeper than I ever thought it would.
We're in the mainframe. So make sure you give us a like, give us a follow. A lot of fun stuff coming up on the pod. So watch this space.
Well, I guess that's it. If you're still listening, thanks for listening right to the very end of the episode. Much appreciated. Bye-bye.
Bye.